Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm really flattered that people came. And so, as Brett mentioned, for my thesis project, I partnered with Paso Pacifico to assess the potential for conservation on private land among rural communities in Nicaragua. Now, although this was an independent thesis research, it was very much a collaborative process between Paso Pacifico, CSU, and myself. And then throughout this whole presentation, you'll be seeing pictures that I took during the field visits, just to give a better idea of the type of environment that I was in during that time. So just to give a heads up about the outline and where we're going to be headed for this next hour or so, I'm going to be giving you a very brief and general description of the history and the context of Nicaragua. Then I'm going to be going over Paso Pacifico's mission and their role in conservation in Nicaragua. On that note, I'll also be explaining what my role was in helping them accomplish that mission. Then we'll be going over some data collection process, and that'll actually lead us to explain the variables and results that I found in this study in further detail. I'll be explaining the analysis that I created that actually derived me at the individual profiles that were created for each of the participants. Then we'll have a conclusion. And then it'll be good news because it'll be almost over. So just to give you an idea, Nicaragua is in Central America and is bordered by Costa Rica and Honduras. Nicaragua has had a very long history of colonization, foreign interventions, and war. Now, the most recent chapter in this history is mostly influenced by my legs are shaking. Sorry. So it's mostly influenced by a dictatorship during Somoza, and that was during the years of 1936 to 1979. That dictatorship can almost be thought of as an actual dynasty because presidency was taken over by the same family. Now, there was a lot of unequal distribution of wealth, poverty, and just in general injustices that were being suffered by the people in Nicaragua during this time. That led to a civil uprising, resulting in a war, a revolution. Now, that war actually lasted decades, starting from the 70s all the way to the early 90s. This was expanded by the result of the introduction of yet another conflict that was known as the Contra-Revolution. Now, as any time there's a war in a country, there is a legacy that is left behind. And Nicaragua is still struggling by being left in shackles and suffered decades of that war. You can see this in the fact that it was only a generation ago, even in my own lifetime. And I've never been in a place that has such a rich and recent history that has marked almost everyone in that land. And you can see this coming about in everyday conversations that went from how did we get here, all the way to the introduction of the recruitment stories and being told how my role in the war was when I was walking home from the store and I got recruited by a truck that was driving by. Or my brother was taken and I never saw him again. Or they returned a coffin and I'm not sure that the person in there was the same person that left. So all of this history is very present in every part of the conversation and culture. There were consequences that were left behind from this war. Now, those consequences can be explained by the social consequences that left, yet again, an unequal distribution of wealth that actually resulted in making Nicaragua the poorest country in Central America, according to the World Bank, and the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, only beat by Haiti. Now, what this additionally, is environmental consequences that we're seeing from this. And every place that has a war, when we talk about the environment, you have to think of the bombs, the fighting, the infrastructure, all of the actual building that was happening to transform the natural landscapes. However, in this case, we're going to focus on what those natural landscapes meant in combination with that history. Because talking to all of my interviewees and just having everyday conversations, you can't look at a mountain or mention a mountain or a hillside or those trees and only focus on those trees and on those animals. Because, well, that's exactly what I see. They see the battleground that they fought. They see the soil that now, not only feeds the nutrients that they need for their crops, it's also the same soil that was shed with blood just a generation ago. So this creates a huge intertwining and complex situation where every landscape already has that cultural and social meaning. And when you have that setting already there, you can't have conservation organizations or agency only focusing on those natural resources. We can't either ignore the social aspect, but especially here, we can't ignore the history nor that meaning that was only built even a generation ago. And with that said, there is a need for organizations that are able to cope with both of those realms. We need conservationists to be able to fix or deal with those environmental problems without ignoring the social aspects. That is actually exactly what Paso Pacifico does. Now, Paso Pacifico is an organization that was founded in 2005. They have the mission to restore and conserve the natural ecosystems of Central America's Pacific slope by collaborating with landowners to promote conservation. They do this in a number of ways, one of which is empowering women through the formation of an oyster cooperative. They also focus on community building by organizing some beach cleanups and have wildlife projects, such as the sea turtle hatcheries and release events. Now, I was lucky enough to be part of all three of these events. However, my specific partnership was focused on that mission and conservation in private lands itself. Now, in the literature, we can see that incorporating private land into conservation schemes allows for an expansion of biodiversity protection because it distributes the financial burden, at lower costs, because it distributes the financial burden across several stakeholders. However, before we can continue with that theory, we have to be able to identify who are the landowners that would be willing to participate in conservation, and also understand the reasons for doing so. That actually became my precise role with Paso Pacifico. The aim of my study was to identify the conservation-oriented landowners that were present in that area by exploring their values and attitudes towards conservation, as well as performing a spatial analysis of the physical attributes of the land itself. Now, with that, the guiding question became, who are the landowners with the most potential for conservation that are present in this area? Now, with that in mind, the area of this study took place in the Pacific coast of southern Nicaragua, in communities that were inside a biological corridor, we can see here in the orange, that was identified by Paso Pacifico and known as Paso del Istmo. Now, while there was an area of focus that Paso Pacifico would like this study to be focused on, ultimately it came down to time and transportation as the deciding factors on seeing which communities were actually going to be implemented into this study. Once those communities were implemented, participant selection was initially based on direct recommendation from Paso Pacifico. And once I had that list, I also implemented a snowball method to where each participant that I was talking to then recommended who I should talk to next. And that way the sample size grew little by little. All of the households were approached from 10 in the morning to 5 p.m. And that was to increase the probability of finding the landowner home after having worked in the field in the morning. However, when they weren't home, I still needed data, so I interviewed the spouse instead. Now, by following this methodology, I completed 38 interviews in 16 communities during the months of July and October of last year. Now, the interview itself was a qualitative, open-ended interview. I never recorded any of the information that was given out, but I was taking a lot of notes. All of those were, so the interview itself had 28 questions that were broken down into 6 different sections, and it took about 1 hour start to finish. The sections included in the interview started with general demographics to get an idea of the situation that the family was living in at the time. I also explored some property attributes that talked about land use, land tenure, but this also included a heavy component of the GIS data that was gathered on the field and used to actually derive a lot of the variables here. Next, we talked about values about nature, because as I said, a deep part of this was exploring exactly those values, as well as the attitudes on wildlife and native plants. The last part of the interview asked participants to talk about their interest in participation in conservation. Now, with that in mind, all of those different categories or sections in the interview were assigned weights. And those weights were based on literature review that gauged the importance and value for conservation and participation in conservation. Now here you can see those sections, starting with the ones with the most weight, so in this case, values about nature and attitude towards wildlife, because literature shows that that can be used as a predictor in participation in conservation. Then we have things like property, because we are very interested in being able to identify the best pieces of land or locations to be able to implement those conservation projects. And then demographics, because the literature shows that there is value in understanding the demographics in the situation, but given all of the rest of this data, they're really not the most important factor here. Now, each of those sections were further broken into individual variables. And each of those variables were derived either from the questions themselves or from the coded responses after all of the interviews had been analyzed. Different sections have different number of values because it depends on how much information I was able to gather. So we see that, for example, demographics only has 3 variables, while property has 9. And in these next sections, we're going to talk in further detail about those. Now, keeping those variables in mind, so remember it was section and then variables. Talking about those variables, each of those were scored on a 10-point scale, from 0 being low and 10 being high, according to their influence in conservation. And again, that influence was based on literature findings. Now, before we go into all of those variables, I will also be presenting the aggregate results or the results that were found for the group in itself, so that we can get a better idea of the type of attitudes and values that are found within the group itself. Now, disclaimer, this is a very individualized and tailored project. So all of these findings cannot be taken and applied to communities themselves or to a greater context because, like I said, it was so tailored to the situation itself. So keeping that in mind, whenever we go over the aggregate results, that is only for the sample size that was part of this study, not for the entire communities, not for Nicaragua. So here first we're going to talk about the values of nature. And in this question, there was 2 variables that were derived. The first was interpretation, and the second one was environmental awareness. Now, interpretation refers to respondents were asked, actually. Respondents were asked to describe what nature meant to them. And we can have an hour conversation about what nature means, but I was interested in what nature meant to them. The scoring categories that you see here are based on the themes that emerged throughout the responses. An inclusion of this variable was based on literature findings, showing that successful conservation depends not only on being able to identify ecological or economic priorities, but also how these align with the prevailing societal values associated with conservation. Assessing that alignment can increase the acceptability rate of conservation planning because it reduces the uncertainty behind it. Therefore, if we're able to identify the societal values behind nature here, we can help increase the acceptability rate of a conservation plan that Paso Pacifico can propose in the future. When we look at the aggregate results, we see that about half of the respondents identified a value system that was related to benefits obtained from nature, otherwise known as ecosystem services. We can also see that about a third of them mentioned values that were related to conservation already, or wildlife habitat, and even an intrinsic value. This shows that there is already a strongly present conservation ethic among the respondents. Now, given this information, I created the next variable, which actually measures the amount of ecosystem services that were mentioned, or those benefits obtained from nature. The inclusion of this variable was based on findings in the literature, showing that the ecosystem services framework highlights the long-term role that ecosystems have played on providing sustainable human well-being, economic development, and poverty alleviation. Recognition of that awareness recognition of those benefits shows an awareness of the important role that the natural environment has on an individual's life. So as I mentioned, here we're going to measure the amount of ecosystem services that were recognized. And we can see that the majority of respondents were able to name at least one ecosystem service, which is very interesting once we get, like past a lot of perceptions that if you're in a farming in a farming community, most likely it would be utilitarian, but we can see that that's not necessarily the case for this study. So what does all of these mean, at least for this question? As I said, both findings corroborate the fact that in the study sample, there is already a very strong present conservation ethic. Now with that in mind, I went ahead and also explored attitudes towards wildlife first. Now in this section, we're going to go over 4 variables. First, people were asked about the presence of wildlife themselves, then asked to identify benefits and damages, and lastly, if they wish to see more. Now starting with that first variable, inclusion was based on the fact that Paso Pacifico was specifically interested in knowing if people were already seeing wildlife in their land. However, an additional purpose that I took for that variable was to measure the likelihood that a particular plot was already being used as habitat by any given species. Now, here we can see in the findings that the vast majority of respondents are already seeing some type of wildlife, and that went anywhere from monkeys all the way to jaguars. Given this information, whoever is already identifying some wildlife has a greater potential for conservation, because as we said, that land is already being visited. Next, I asked about the benefits that people thought they received from wildlife. An inclusion of this variable was based on findings in the literature that benefits from wildlife is actually the most important factor in explaining attitude towards it. Therefore, here in the similar version as the values, we can see that the amount of benefits is what was being measured here. If we explore that, we see that about half of the respondents were not able to identify a benefit. However, of those that did, the most commonly mentioned benefits were based around ecosystem services, as we can see here, and tourism that came up time and time and again. But we can also see that there's some economic benefits that were tied with that, as well as pure conservation and intrinsic value that was placed on wildlife. Now, being able to identify a benefit gave the participants a higher score on their potential for conservation because there is already some relation between my well-being and the presence of wildlife. And when we ask about benefits, we must also look at the other side, which in this case was damages. Now, inclusion of this variable was based on literature findings that in some communities, there is a prevailing negative attitude towards wildlife, even though they receive benefits. Now, those negative attitudes stem from damages that are received to crops, predation on wildlife, and a loss of control over those animal resources. In this case, I didn't measure the amount of damages that were mentioned because in most cases, when a damage was mentioned, it was only one. So having that, that category of multiple wouldn't really change the chart here. We can see that there isn't a substantial difference between those that were able to name a damage and those that weren't. However, in this case, those that did identify a damage had less potential for conservation because they are already having that negative correlation between wildlife and what it means to me. Those damages that were most commonly mentioned, interestingly enough, reflect exactly what was found on the literature. It was either predation on their livestock by 22% or 61% of those damages being related to damages to crops. Now, lastly, all of the respondents were asked to state if they wanted to see more wildlife on their plot. And inclusion of this variable was based on the idea that Paso Pacifico is already very interested in that, and they wanted to know, literally, if they wanted more wildlife on their plot. Now, following that, we see here that there's 2 categories. Either you want more or you don't. As you can see in these results, good news are the most people do want to see more wildlife. And reasons for wanting to see more were so varied, but they included anything from, I like to look at them, or sure, as long as it doesn't eat my cow. Now, following that same framework, we have the same variables. Oh, before that, what does this mean? So it means that there is an increased potential for conservation when there is a positive attitude towards wildlife. That positive attitude is based on having more benefits than damages related to wildlife. It also depends on wanting to see more and having more interactions with that wildlife. Following that same framework, those variables were asked again for native plants themselves. Now, Paso Pacifico is already very involved in reforestation programs. So when we're talking about benefits, in my idea, we can use some of the benefits here to identify motivations for adoption of the reforestation programs. Here we can see that most people not only identified a type of benefit, but they identified multiple. There is already a very positive attitude in the study sample towards native plants. And when we look into the damages, no, before that, most of those benefits were again related to ecosystem services. And of those, the specific type of provisioning, thinking of native trees as potential wood for building my next home or fixing the structure that I already have within my property. So having native plants in your plot is already a way for you to be able to expand your property or assure that it will be standing there for a long time. As you can see in the chart. Okay, now talking about damages. Now, here we can see that it was the same type of scoring system that I followed as wildlife. And again, the inclusion for this was based on the fact that Paso Pacifico already does a lot of work for reforestation. So if we can identify the specific damages that people have or they think they receive from having native plants, then we can also translate that to indicate the barriers to adoption of this program. We can see that most people weren't identifying any damages at all. But it's interesting to note that those damages that were being mentioned, all of them were related to cattle. Whether it's trees limiting grass growth, or it's my cattle having some bad symptoms by ingesting the leaves or fruit from trees, or having reforestation programs present you with a choice of do I have more trees or do I limit or eliminate my cattle? It wasn't something that you can integrate both. It was a choice. It was a perception that it was a choice. Now, lastly, people were also asked if they wanted to see more native plants. And this can actually help Paso Pacifico identify who is not already involved in reforestation and who they could talk to next. If they already want to see more, then why not offer a way for them to make that come true? We can see that the majority of participants are interested in having an increased amount of native plants on their land. Now, what does this all mean? Again, following the same logic as we did for wildlife, a positive attitude towards native plants can increase your potential for conservation, and that positive attitude is based on being able to identify more benefits than damages and wanting to see more of it on your land. Following this, people were asked about their actual interest in conservation, if they would be interested in participating in a given program that could be anything from related to water, to wildlife, to native plants. Basically, any program that could help nature. Although this question was meant to be binary, either you're interested or not, after coding all of the responses, it became clear that there had to be an addition of two categories. One of them is already involved, because it turned out a lot of people I was talking to were already involved in conservation. But then additionally, there was a conditional interest, saying, sure, I would be interested if. Now, those ifs actually became very important. And they were so varied that presenting a chart of it wouldn't help you at all, because it would almost be like presenting you with a pizza of equal slices for reasons. So they became very individual reasons for everybody. However, what does help here is that we can see the majority of respondents are already interested in participating in conservation. Now, Paso Pacifico can take this information and see who they can talk to next. But it can also mean that Participants in this category have an increased potential for conservation because they've already thought of it. They've thought of it enough to have an opinion of whether they're interested or not. Now, in the following sections, after we've explored the values and attitudes, as I said, there is a spatial component to this study. And that spatial component was based on, sorry, running out of breath here. Now, that spatial component was based on data gathered on the field. The variables we're going to be looking at for the spatial analysis are listed here. And they're mostly based on proximity, but I'll expand on that later. Then we're going to end with some properties about variables about the property that are not so much based on the spatial location of them. So before you, you can see a PDF version of an ArcGIS map that I digitized showing a visual representation of some of the findings for this study. I'll be going over each of the layers in this map specifically in the following segments. However, this will become the second deliverable that will be given to Paso Pacifico. As I mentioned before, there are individual profiles that I'll expand on at the end. And there is this ArcGIS component of it, at least on the PDF version. Now, all of the GIS data came from two sources. A GPS point was collected on the side of all of the interviews. Additionally, each participant was asked to draw a representation of their property. On that representation, they were asked to indicate property size, land use, location of water sources, and location of any infrastructure that was found within their land. Now, all of that data I took, digitized, and made not only that PDF map, but to facilitate communication, also made an interactive bilingual map that can be used by Paso Pacifico. Now, this hasn't yet been shared nor made public, so we're going to see the working version of this. In the first page, you'll find a map that's very similar to the PDF version that we were looking at earlier, accompanied with a brief bilingual explanation of the study itself. When we move to the next page, we see what becomes the first layer of the map. And those are the digitized drawings that every participant volunteered during the study. Now, using this information, there was the variable of property size that was derived. Now, for these variables, I won't be going over the categories for the scoring, nor the aggregate results because we would be here all day. But all of that information will be included in the final results. Property sizes were all indicated using manzanas, and that is a commonly used measuring unit in Nicaragua that is equivalent to 0.7 hectares. So before digitizing anything, I converted every property size to reflect hectares, digitized that in the location using the georeference point taken in the interview site, and that's what you see there. For the next variables, they were based on calculating, before that. So still on the properties here, as I said, participants were also asked to expand on their land use. And this will actually be explained a bit further in the variable once we go back to the PowerPoint. However, here you can see the digitized land uses that participants did volunteer when they explained where each land use that they implemented took place, as well as a bilingual legend that facilitates interpretation of this map. Now, once we move on to the next set of variables, they were all calculated by using the minimum distance between two polygons. And this was done by using an ArcGIS spatial analyst tool to create the model that you see here. Now here, it takes the polygons of the shapefile private lands and compares the minimum distance to any given polygon of a different layer. Now, all of these different layers are the ones that I will be talking about next. The first of these comes when we look at the minimum distance between each of the private lands and priority restoration areas for connectivity. These are areas that Paso Pacifico identified as having the most impact in increasing connectivity in the biological corridor if they were to be worked on. Now, the assumption here is that the closest a private land is to any of these red areas, then the more priority we can place on it, thus increasing their potential for conservation, because we want to ultimately increase that connectivity. Under that same assumption, we look at the minimum distance between each of those private lands in core conservation areas. Now again, these are areas that Paso Pacifico identified as having the most effect if they were to be included in conservation programs. Alright, back to variables. So the next variable here, I actually calculated under the assumption that we want to have a greater connectivity between already existing protected areas and private lands. Now, these protected areas are those that are legally recognized by Marena, which is Nicaragua's Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources. Lastly, on this map, we'll see the minimum distance between each of those private lands and a private reserve. These are also areas that are recognized by Marena, that Ministry for the Environment and Natural Resources. The spatial information for this shapefile was acquired through a website called Reservas Silvestres. It was downloaded, imported into our GIS, and digitized to be able to show the locations of each of those areas. Now, all of that concludes the actual spatial analysis. However, additional variables in that property section also looked at land tenure. And land tenure becomes important when we look at the findings in literature showing that part owners or tenants are less likely to sign up for conservation strategies. Additionally, interviews revealed that renting or merely taking care of a land limits your land use decision-making capacity because you have to get permission prior to implementing any new land use, such as conservation. The scoring categories here are based on ownership. So if you own a land, you get the highest points. And as we move down to caretaker, we see that the score also decreases along with that. Thankfully, the majority of the respondents for this category owned their land, giving them full land use decision-making power, therefore increasing their potential for conservation because we can bypass that middle step and have somebody make a decision whether they want to participate or not. Explaining the land use that we saw digitized on that map before, this is the breakdown of the actual categories that were used to score that variable. And this variable was included because literature shows that there are fundamental differences between the attitudes on land conservation that are attributable to land use. Additionally, in the interviews, after being coded, it was revealed that livestock actually has a negative influence to conservation, while reforestation and agriculture have a positive influence. And we can see that being reflected in the scores that each of these categories were given. For the sample size, we see that the great majority of people partake in agriculture and in cattle. And although this doesn't give them a very high score, it does have a lot of information when thinking about Paso Pacifico being able to tailor conservation programs that might be more compatible with the land uses that are already being implemented on the land. Now, an additional category that was added from this data is remnants. And this looks at any untransformed native forest that was specifically listed by the landowner as a type of land use. Now, the assumption here is that the fewer actions a landowner is taking to conserve native plants, the more they would prefer a landscape, or they would be okay with the landscape without those native plants. Therefore, it was important to identify who is already taking those actions. There was no aggregate result chart there because only 4% of people mentioned forests as a type of land use. So what does all of this information mean? It means that when we look at the private land itself, removed from the landowner, we can definitely go for all of those that are located closest to areas of interest, whether those are areas of interest that Paso Pacifico identified or that I added. The closer they are, the highest potential they have for conservation. However, when we look at additional values, such as land tenure and land use, we have to take into account the social aspect of what's actually happening on that land. Now, all of those land uses that are the most compatible with conservation increase people's potential for conservation here. And when they own the land, they have more decision-making power, therefore also increasing their potential for conservation. The last section of the interview that we're going to go over here is demographics. And in this section, we're going to talk about 3 variables, those that you can see here. Starting with age, we look at the participants' age in years. Now, the literature shows that younger farmers are more willing to take risks in general, and they're also more willing to adopt conservation strategies. Following that logic, younger participants in the study were giving a higher score than older participants. We can see that only by a little are more participants older than 60 years old. However, the considerable amount of them are between that 41 to 60 years old age. Now, this section was only given a weight of 3%, because while we can find in the literature that younger farmers are more willing to take risks, in this case, one of the best people that I talked to was 63. And I can't find myself giving this variable a high weight when I know that the actual values and attitudes have so much more to say than someone's birthday. The next variable was household size. And this was based on the assumption found in literature that the larger a family is, the more resources they'll use, which negatively influence conservation. Now, the categories here split family sizes between less than 4 people to more than 6 people. In the aggregate results, we can see that most families were actually less than 4 people, which are good news for Paso Pacifico once we're basing those on the literature that was mentioned before. Now, the last variable here is time in area. And this looks at the amount of time that a person has lived in or spent in the area relative to their lifetime. The reasons for getting to these areas were so based on that war and on those events that I mentioned earlier that we don't have a lot of participants that have been born and raised there. But we do have a considerable amount of participants that have been there for over half of their lifetime. Literature shows that the more a family is present in an area, the more time they spend in it, the more sense of a sympathy that they build, and thus are more willing to take care of this land. Additionally, through interviews, I was able to get the sense that the more time people spent in the area, the more familiar and overall knowledgeable they were of the limitations that existed. Now, in this, as I mentioned before, we can get an idea of who people are given their demographics, given that age, how many people live in an area or property, or how long they've been there. We can't base a lot of our actual score on that because there's so much more information that was acquired through those values and attitudes that I expanded on before. So although this does have an influence on a person's potential for conservation, it's only a small influence. Now that we've gone through all of those variables and explained their scoring categories, we can talk about the actual score that each of the participants got. Now, the scoring system that was used for analyzing all of this data is actually the same that a teacher may use to grade your homeworks and your tests and give you a final grade at the end of the class. Now, keep that thought as we move forward. So all of the scores for a category were added up, and they were divided by the number of possible points for that category. In this example, we see that this particular person scored a 63 on the category of attitudes towards wildlife. Then we take into account the predetermined weights that were based on literature. We multiply that category score by the category weight. We follow the same procedure for every section. And we add all of those scores and multiply by 100. In this example, we see all of the scores that this person received. We see how they were multiplied by each of the corresponding weights, and we ultimately arrive at a potentiality score for that person. As I said before, this is a very individualized and tailored study, given that all of the scores reflect a person at the time of the study. Now, given the maximum and minimum scores that were found in the sample size, I then created scoring categories to facilitate communication of that potentiality. We see that scores go all the way from an optimal potential to a minimal potential and everything in between. Now, in our sample size, we see the distribution of those categories, with the most participants scoring in that medium section, only 2 respondents scoring in that optimal section, and a considerable amount between that minimal and low. So if we go back to the guiding question, who has the most potential for conservation? That was done by creating individual profiles for everybody. People in the optimal and high categories have the most potential for conservation. However, that doesn't mean that we start there and end there. It means that everybody else in that medium section, what's limiting them from being one category higher? Or that minimal and low category, what are those barriers? Where were their scores lowest? Was it on that wildlife section? Was it on that native plant section? Or was it in general they're just not interested? So through the creation of these individual profiles, you'll see the icons that were presented for each of the scoring categories for those variables. Now, the weird-looking polygons reflect all of the spatial analysis variables, all scored on the same scale of 0 to 10. Here we'll see what the person scored for the category itself, if we don't want to look at the individual profiles. And we'll also see the category of potentiality in which they scored, along with the color code to facilitate that translation. Now, there was some discomfort in only identifying people by numbers and symbols and calling it a day, which is why there was an addition of a qualitative data that is direct translation from each respondent during the interview. The backside of this includes a digitized map showing the location of this private land, along with a description of the land uses that are being implemented at the time of the study. Now, the legend here is bilingual, and the units are expressed both in manzanas and in hectares. Now, for cases where there was data missing, as we can see here, there is no spatial data for those spatial attributes. The scores were adjusted to be taken only out of the available variables. And that was done to avoid having low scores not really reflecting reality. So whenever there was a missing variable for any category, the scores were readjusted to be only taken out of the possible points. So in conclusion, we've gone over conservation, Paso Pacifico, my role in Paso Pacifico, and the entire design and description of this study. But if there's a takeaway point here, is that this information is very useful and very applicable to the organization for the individuals that took part of this study. As I mentioned before, and I'll reiterate here, we cannot use any of these findings to make broader statements of a community nor a agglomeration of communities. However, it's an indication. It's at least a starting point for 38 people, understanding their values, understanding their attitudes, and using that to tailor conservation projects or tailor outreach and understand what those barriers that are limiting people from participating are, and highlighting those motivations. I forgot what I wrote next. And just on an ending point for that, As I mentioned before, my guiding question was to identify the landowners with the most potential. And that was done through the creation and explanation of individual profiles. However, we cannot and should not at all ignore people that landed in the low and minimal categories. It doesn't mean that they have zero potential. It just means that it creates a more fun challenge for Paso Pacifico and for us. Now, before opening the floor to questions, I'd like to go over a short reflection to what this entire process meant for me. As Brett mentioned, there was a period of sudden change from having months of preparation to go do a group thesis in Kenya to now doing an individual thesis in Nicaragua. Now, I myself do a great job at constantly surrounding myself with people so that I can bounce my ideas back and forth and have everything be either corroborated by my peers or shut down by my peers. Being able to travel in maybe a month's notice, design a project on my own, trust my idea, and stand 100% behind it, while being able to say that 6 months later, that was still a good idea, and that presentation of it was still going to be good, was by far the biggest challenge I've ever had in my life. Coming up with ideas in a closed room is not something I do. Implementing those ideas by myself is not something that I do. Communicating things through art, graphic design, or any form of craft of art is not something that I do. But a great inspiration for pushing through all of those boundaries was understanding the happiness that is found in the most limiting areas and communities. Walking into a home of a total stranger, asking them to take an hour of their time while they offer you coffee, share some of the tortillas they just made, while you know that they're struggling to get day by day, but you're in their home. You are part of them at that time. They have their boundaries. They know what they need to live. They're also willing to push past those boundaries, share not only their experiences, but share everything that they can. And with that, I wanted to thank, first and foremost, my family. My dad, for being here, has been a great inspiration to be in school and continue taking advantage of that privilege. Also, everybody in Paso Pacifico for being so understanding of the fact that I had no idea what I was doing at the beginning, being okay with that, and helping the entire process. But more specifically, a great mentor and friend that we all know here, that is Eduardo Bonet, as we all know as Lalo, who helped me not only decide to go by talking great things about it, but also still being there to support me even nowadays. Thank you, Lalo. Also to CSU, CSU and my committee members for supporting me in such a different context, especially Brett Lawrence Briere, for understanding something that's not Kenya and being able to apply that. And lastly, the CLTL cohort of 4.0 and also 3.0 that were very, very helpful in helping me support this. And to a person that actually became my research partner from New Zealand. Leah was always there to help me make sense of what literally made no sense and I was about to turn in. Not to look at some of the citations and literature that was used. With that, are there any questions?
So I don't have any background in this, so there's some vocabulary that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
What specifically is an environmental service?
So that's a benefit that people can receive from nature, and that's nature in its untransformed state at the time, right? Okay. So if it can be anything from like storm protection from mangroves to actually using the resources and transforming those, as in this case was construction. So it's literally like any benefit, any good thing that you can obtain from nature.
This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I would love to see what happened if you did this in Colorado. You would gain a lot of really valuable insights, and it was wonderful. And your introduction got me thinking about the sort of the battlefields and sort of the history, the deep history that all of these lands can tell.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you got any inkling from your interviews about whether people were interested in conservation just because of those battles or the fighting that took place. I'm thinking of like our national battlefields and places like the Stone Creek Massacre site where we are now conserving nature because of something that happened. I didn't know if maybe it's too fresh for people there to think that way.
You know, I think that's definitely a factor. I don't think it's something that we can look as it's part of our past. We should take care of it. It's something that this is where I lived and that hill is where I fought. So it's very recent, and there is a sense of connection to those natural landscapes, but I'm not sure it's enough of a connection, or not enough of a connection, but if that connection can be translated to making those a protected area. Because there is that coexistence between having this be the land that I work, also having it be the land that I want to take care of. So I think it would just be a continuation of that coexistence with a influencing factor that is the history that took place there. Yeah.
Okay, so awesome job.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I was in Nicaragua last week. This made me want to go back.
Yeah.
Also, now the space makes me want to go back. But so I know that this is contextual to the coast and the specific part of the coast. We work in the interior of Nicaragua, and I wanted to know. I know that Paso Pacifico probably laid some groundwork in terms of identifying the priority biodiversity corridors, wildlife corridors, and conservation areas. Apart from that, was the survey instrument contextual to the coast, or could it be replicated, say, in a highland area or in the plains areas?
Yeah, I think once we talk about the GIS component, those spatial variables would change, because then you'd have to identify what actual physical attributes would be influential there. But as far as the questions, they could be applied to a community that wasn't just based on the coast. Kayla, you had your hand up for a while.
You said that your favorite interview was from a 63-year-old, and I was wondering what was said in the interview and what you liked about it.
Yeah, so my questions, as I said, like explored values and attitudes, but it almost turned into every question had so much meaning. I mean, I spent 2 hours talking to this lady, and it was amazing, because even talking about, why are you here? What brought you to the area? Well, it was like a full-on history, but then it's also like, why would I not be here? Look around you. Don't you hear those things, like the bird singings? Can you feel that fresh air? Why would I not want to be here? And it was so hard for me to be able to convey that passion that I just wrote literally every word that she said. So her interview, when I was coding it, I was like, oh. But that's actually when I hit the realization point of I couldn't just have numbers and symbols on this sheet when there's so much passion behind phrases that were mentioned during those interviews, what actually inspired me to have the addition to that qualitative part of it.
Very cool.
Yeah. Jem?
Yeah, Emma, that was so wonderful. I had one question when you were speaking about the interest in participating in conservation, and you added that additional category of depends. What were some of themes that you can think of, or general ideas as to what did depend on if they participated or not?
Yeah. So some themes that came up in that is it depends on how much it would cost for me. If it's free, then yeah, I would totally plant the trees. If I had to buy them, I'm not sure that I would. Or it depends on where do they want to do it? In my paddock? Because I have cattle. So I want to keep those cattle. Is there a way that it can be around my property instead of in it? So it was very much like an interest, but more of understanding, these are my circumstances. Does that program fit in my circumstances? Yeah.
Just
wondering if you have any plan to see how successful the information. So you give this information, you have these profiles, and the organization, I assume, now goes and tries to ask these people depending on how highly ranked they are. What's like the follow-up? Like how do you have a plan to figure out if that information was incredibly beneficial? What's the next step, or is there any?
Yeah, I mean, as of now, my life steps went to 1 p.m. today, so I think that was fast. Yeah, but I think. But definitely, I mean, this isn't something that I want to spend like months in, develop it, and say, here you go, do whatever you want with it. And for me, it's a privilege to have, Lalo in my life because I can continue pestering him and be like, hey, what happened with my studies?
Yeah.
But definitely keeping track of that because it is something that I really liked. I got very passionate about it, and the goal is that it's actually useful for the organization. Audrey?
Yeah, I wondered what role trust played, both kind of how the community's view of Paso Pacifico was, if you were seen as an extension of Paso Pacifico, and how that maybe played in their willingness or unwillingness.
Yeah, so it played a huge role. And I actually failed to mention the name of, I can't remember if I did. I had a blacked out there for a little bit. But so my field partner, Marvin Chavez, was actually the one that was with me for most of the interviews. And he was born and raised in this area. So everybody knew him. Like as we were driving down, literally people would wave to him, he'd honk at people, we gave rides to everybody. So when I was walking up next to the cool guy, they were like, yeah, like you're totally in, we trust him. He wouldn't bring somebody that's just extracting information out of nowhere. And a lot of it with me asking questions and him being like, well, this is what she means, it's like, well, what about this and this and that. So a lot of that information was very volunteered because I was there with him. Had I gone by myself, I don't think we would be seeing the same results at all. Yeah.
So this might be too much of a question, but suppose you had unlimited funds and you wanted to move, and you wanted to do something with the communities within Nicaragua to move people from the low potentiality categories to the high potentiality categories.
Yeah.
What would you target? What would you do?
I think the first would be exploring that perception of the choice between cattle and reforestation, or cattle and native plants. And I would like to explore solutions that were proposed by everybody that mentioned those limitations. To be like, well, if you're interested or if you're not interested, what would a live fence be better around your property? Or is there an area that's not really used that we can maybe plant trees on? So rather than, I think since that came about so much, I'd like to explore the solutions that people have already thought of and that maybe could be communicated to Paso Pacifico.
Based on that question, are there any ideas such as agroforestry that are being implemented in order to address that problem?
I'm not sure I could answer that with full confidence. I know Paso Pacifico is doing a lot and a very varied number of projects. There is a lot of focus on reforestation, and I'm pretty sure they do already live fences, but I'm not sure of the specifics of agroforestry. Audrey?
Sorry, I had a methodology question. Is there a reason why you didn't record the interviews? Was that suggested by Paso Pacifico? Was it, again, based on trust?
It ultimately came down to my preference. I didn't want to show up with a fancy computer or a fancy phone and on horseback to some of these communities whose homes are made out of the wood around them and that are sharing their food that I know is already limited. So I think it would already put me as I'm not only an outsider coming in to look at you, but I have more than you, and I'm just going to show it off. So for me, it became that. So I just got really good at writing really fast. Yeah.
Sorry. So if you could redo this study, if you could go back in time and do this again with the knowledge you know now, what would you do differently? Would you do anything differently?
I would. I'd do a lot of things differently. Well, I think first I would have liked to be more familiar with what people are able to interpret or read at the time of the study, so that when I was designing all of these questions and thinking of a report, And I could also have something very easy that I could hand back to everybody. I would like to done all of this and have a product that I can go back to everybody that I interviewed and thank them for their participation and be able to give them something that they can see what they contributed to. I would like to have a lot more interviews than what I did. And then also I think the GIS data was going to be this grand scheme, Landsat-based type of project, but because of money and time, it didn't end up being that. So I would have liked to also enhance that portion of it. Yeah.
One more quick one. With Paso Pacifico, since they work with bird communities quite a bit, from my knowledge of what they're doing, is there any like direct, like looking at how the conservation value of these agricultural areas could improve for wildlife? As you know, that was one of my focus in Guatemala. Are there any actual direct like bird surveys or tangible things that they could say, you know, a certain density of trees or a certain type of bush might improve the conservation value for those particular species?
Yeah, so there's definitely wildlife monitoring that's already going on. As far as the trees, as the birds, I'm sorry, live in the trees. There's already conservation projects like around recruiting people and taking care of nests that they're able to identify in a given tree. And when they're able to identify that, then there's some economic incentive to making sure that even the surrounding area is also protected, which actually has decreased deforestation in that area. Yes, there's definitely already work there. Any more questions?
All right, thanks, Emma.